Well, we are so pleased. Who here heard Melanie Phillips when she came to the University of Redlands a year or two ago? She was great. So I got an email that she was planning a trip to the U.S. again. I jumped on the opportunity, and fortunately her schedule lined up with our meeting, so we were able to get her here. She's a British author and journalist. Her books include the very prophetic Londonistan, written in 2006. And things are far worse in terms of that regard now. And the parallel that she's going to talk about is the undermining of Western values. And she talked about that in her book, The World Turned Upside Down, A Global Battle for God, Truth, and Power. You can reach her at melaniephillips.com. There's ongoing articles and videos that she puts up there. And her Twitter feed is at Melanie Latest. And so again, you can get everything that she's writing on. She writes both in the Times of London and the Jerusalem Post. Now, before she came here, she sent out this email and tried to envision what it might be like to come to the shores of America, that far land, far away, across the ocean. So this is what she thinks of coming to America. Now, interestingly, you may have heard that there was some Milo Yiannopoulos tried to speak at the University of California at Berkeley, and that resulted in a huge riot while the police stood back and watched rioters destroy university property and beat up people. Then Ann Coulter wanted to speak there, and the threat of riot caused the university to impose such restrictions that her speech got canceled. David Horowitz was going to speak there again, such restrictions that his speech got canceled. Some conservatives tried to have a rally there, and the leftist brown shirts attacked them in the streets while the police stood back and did nothing. Someone comes up to police officers who were standing there. Of course, it's not the officer's fault. They were to stand down orders. Because people are being beat up over there really bad, and the officer goes, and? So they were to stand down orders. But anyways, Melanie was in Berkeley just yesterday, and I did not hear any reports of rioting, so maybe she will tell us how she managed to get in and out of Berkeley safely and not cause a riot. So the title of her program here tonight is A World in Turmoil, an Islamic Europe for a Western Spring. I'm pleased and honored to have Melanie Phillips as our speaker.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening, everybody. Yes, I did speak in Berkeley, and I have lived. I'm actually quite insulted I didn't spark a riot. I think obviously I didn't do something right. But it's another story. You can read what happened on my website, melaniephillips.com. I managed to post up an account of what I did, and I managed actually to speak into my iPhone on the Sproul Plaza. Again, no one actually knew that I was actually not just muttering into my iPhone like so many people, that I was actually having had the intention of putting it on my website. So you can, if you want to see what actually happened and what I actually said, you can go to my website, melaniephillips.com. I bring you greetings from Britain, the mothership of freedom, where, like you, the people of Britain have now decided to take back their country, and it is really. And it's really great to be among people here, to be among you all here, people who understand what freedom actually means, who are prepared to stand up for the rule of law and are not afraid to express the love of their nation. And this is how the West, I hope, will now develop. But the point of what I'm saying this evening is that I think we're at a crucial tipping point for the West. We are living through, as you know, through absolutely momentous times. Political developments are taking place across the West. Choices are being made by the people, which many people never thought would be possible. People are taking decisions that really are quite simply to bring about a different kind of society from the one that has been taken for granted for decades. In Britain, as you may know, last year, Britain decided in its referendum that it was going to leave the European Union. Now, The received wisdom by the entire intellectual and political class was that this could never happen, because the only people who wanted to leave the European Union were racist, white supremacist, troglodyte, knuckle-dragging troglodytes who had no education, and in the words of the then Prime Minister David Cameron, were closet racists and basically lunatics. You know the insult. And that set of insults really galvanized people, because they turned around and voted to come out of the European Union as soon as they were given a chance. And the reason they did so was because they simply wanted to govern themselves in accordance with the traditions and cultures of a democratic nation called the United Kingdom. In mainland Europe, this very weekend, France is facing a momentous decision in its presidential election, and once again, the two candidates who are facing off in that presidential election this Sunday are candidates who nobody ever thought would be in that position, because they are, each of them, not aligned with conventional politics. On the one hand, you have Marine Le Pen, who comes from the Front National, the National Front, which for years was a party considered to be at the fringes of French politics. She is facing off against another political outsider, a man called Emmanuel Macron, who appears to have been parachuted in from planet Zog. He's come apparently from nowhere. I'd like to know who's behind him, but anyway. He is tipped to become the next president of France, and he is said to be a centrist. And of course, here in this wonderful country of yours, someone who everyone received wisdom said could never be elected to any responsible position anywhere in society has mysteriously become President of the United States. Now, all these changes have been taking place against the background in Britain and Europe of Islamization, the transformation of Western European countries through a combination of mass Muslim immigration, with a lot of Muslims who do not wish to immigrate, or to integrate into the European countries that they've come into, but want those European countries to adapt to them, and the escalating threat of Islamic terrorism. And many, many people are very, very anxious indeed about what's happening. They're not just anxious about the Islamization problem, they're anxious about these great changes that we have been living through, that I just described. They're very anxious about Brexit, they're very anxious about Donald Trump, they're very anxious about the changes going on in Europe. They fear instability, and they fear that dark forces are being unleashed. They think that what's been happening in Brexit, in America, and in Europe, although these contexts are very different, they think that what's been happening is a great wave of what's called populism, or nationalism. And both of these words, populism and nationalism, are boo words. Populism suggests not that it's popular, but that it's basically the mob that's been unleashed in an irrational way. And nationalism, as we know, leads to prejudice and bigotry and war and all bad things. So people are extremely concerned. Now, I have some sympathy with these concerns. Change is always risky. That's the nature of change, and these are very, very big changes. But I have a different view from this pessimism. I think there are dangers from these convulsions, but I also think that this is the first and only opportunity that I have seen in my professional lifetime for the West to save itself from what I have been describing for the last 2-3 decades as progressive cultural suicide. Now, what's happening in the West takes different forms and is in different contexts in Britain and in Europe, mainland Europe, and in America, quite obviously. But there are some common threads, and this great revolt by the people is not, in my view, just a protest against an out-of-touch political establishment. It's not just a protest by the Rust Belt, which has been left behind by prosperity. In my view, it is a revolt against an entire world view, an entire way of looking at the world, which, in my opinion, has been steadily undermining the West for more than half a century. And what I see is happening in Britain and in America and in Europe, although I think that it's particularly hopeful what's happening in Britain and America, is not nationalism or populism, these blue words. It is the restoration of Western national identity, identification with the values of the West, and to say that we wish to govern ourselves in accordance with these values, and we no longer wish to undermine them, we wish to defend them against the threats that are being mounted against them. Earth do we get ourselves into a situation where the West, which embodies the good things of life, freedom, equality, caring for others, a sense of progress, reason, all these good things, how did the West get itself into a position where it decided that it was actually a really bad thing? And I think this demoralization in every sense really got going on mainland Europe and spread out. Because I think this thing dates from World War II. You could actually trace it back further, but I would start it at World War II, the end of World War II. People in Europe were completely horrified by the rise of Nazism and fascism, by the Holocaust, by the World War. And what really horrified them was that this was the very sort of center of civilized values. You know, in Germany they were people of high culture who sent the Jews and others to the death camps. They were people who appreciated Goethe, they loved Mozart, they loved opera, they were cultured people. It was considered to be the center of reason, the center of enlightened thinking, and look what happened. And I think that that did something terrible to the whole European psyche. It kind of lost faith in progress. It kind of lost faith in reason. And above all, it lost faith in itself as European civilization and as Western civilization. And it created a mood, more than a mood, it created a whole political a way of thinking which went far beyond Europe and became the kind of received wisdom among progressive people. That above all, we had to stop fascism from ever again stalking the corridors of Europe. And in order to stop fascism and Nazism, we had to understand that these things grew out of nationalism, and that nationalism was the problem. And so we had to stop nationalism. And in order to stop nationalism, we had to undermine the nation. Because without the nation, you wouldn't have nationalism, and without nationalism, you wouldn't have fascism, the Holocaust, and war. Now, I think this was very misguided in various respects. I don't think that fascism grew out of nationalism. I think it grew out of various other things as well. But the fact is that if you get rid of the Western nation, then you get rid of the vehicle that expresses the greatest values that we should be defending. Anyway, what happened was, because of this belief that you had to undermine the Western nation, which was bad, in order to protect freedom and democracy, the very opposite happened, that the undermining of the nation actually undermined freedom and democracy. Because what happened in Europe was this belief that instead of the nation, you should have instead institutions which embodied the notion of the brotherhood of man. You know, the Western nation was considered to be innately bad. Why? Because first of all, it was associated with capitalism, and as we all know, capitalism destroys everything in its path. It's entirely a bad thing, and without capitalism, the world would be a very happy place. And the West, because it was capitalist, had basically destroyed the life chances of and oppressed all the peoples of the developing world who were not capitalist societies. So the West was really, really bad from that point of view. And the West also was not just bad, but it was a nation. It was embodied through the nation state. And the nation state was innately bad because it was exclusive, i.e., anybody who wasn't part of that nation was excluded from it, and therefore couldn't be part of it. And therefore the nation was innately something which set up prejudice and bigotry. All those things became the kind of received wisdom of the progressive classes. And this all led to the idea that the transnational institutions, supranational institutions, institutions which did not rest upon the Western nation as a sovereign entity governing itself through its own laws, but institutions which brought nations together. These were the only things which were morally okay. So transnational institutions like, for example, the sainted United Nations, without which no Western country can ever go to war. Institutions like, institutions of law, like international law, and international human rights law. Countries like Britain and Europe signed up to these conventions. International Criminal Court, you don't have this phenomenon here, I believe. But in Britain and Europe, we surrendered our own ability for our own governments to govern ourselves according to our own laws, on the basis that it was a superior virtue to be in a collective transnational institution with international law, because that embodied the brotherhood of man, it embodied us all working together as humanity, rather than dividing each other by being part of one individual Western nation. Now, Europe, as I say, was demoralized. It was demoralized by the Second World War, it was demoralized by Nazism. So you can sort of understand why it turned against the nation in this way. It basically decided that the nations of Europe could never again be trusted not to descend again into barbarism. It lost faith in itself. But you know, Britain wasn't like that. Britain, as you know, in 1940 famously stood alone, and Britain was never part of mainland Europe. In many ways, Britain is completely different from mainland Europe. And you know, Britain helped win the war against Nazism. It was a very important country in winning the war against Nazism. So why did Britain join the European Union? And the answer was that Britain, you may find this surprising, but the end of the Second World War saw Britain very demoralized as well, for two reasons. Although it had won the war against Nazism, it emerged from that war bankrupt, heavily in debt to America, which, as you all know, came to the rescue of the world during that war. But Britain ended up in hock to America, and this was obviously not a good state to be in. And the second, more shattering thing that happened to Britain was, in the famous words, was it of Dean Rusk, it lost an empire and never found a role. By the end of the Second World War, it had almost, a little bit later perhaps, it divested itself of its empire. And consequently, the British ruling class, because of these two things, the bankruptcy of Britain and the loss of the empire and the loss of its role in the world, the British ruling class became very demoralized. And the British ruling class decided that Britain could never again be a great nation, could never again be a great power, could never again sustain an economy which would be able to survive in the world independently. And the watchword of the British official class for all those years after the Second World War, right through to Mrs. Thatcher in the 80s, the watchword of the British political class, these sort of officials that go from one generation of politicians to another and keep the show on the road, their watchword was that the highest goal of the British official class was the orderly management of decline. The most they could hope for was that there wouldn't be riots on the streets as Britain slowly subsided into inferior world status. And on that basis, they grasped the European Union, which wasn't then called the European Union, it was the European Union project. They grasped it as a kind of drowning man clutches a straw. They thought that the European Union project would enable Britain to survive. That without it, without something like that, a great sort of protectionist bloc, they couldn't survive. And so Britain joined the European Union. And this demoralization that I'm talking about didn't just take political form of joining the European Union. It also made the British ruling elites, the intellectual elites, the political elites, it made them, because they were demoralized, because they no longer believed in Britain, because they no longer believed in their nation, and they no longer believed in the Western nation, They no longer believed in the things that the West stands for anymore. It had been shattered for them for all these reasons. And therefore they were very vulnerable to a whole lot of very, very destructive and dangerous ideas which came out of the left and which were all based similarly on the same premise that the West was innately bad. Scroll back and you find that long before the Soviet Union collapsed, long before communism collapsed, the Berlin Wall fell, long before that, progressively minded people had come to the conclusion that Soviet communism really wasn't a flag behind which they wished to march anymore. They had realized that it was cruel, it was vicious, it was totalitarian, and it was absolutely useless. And they also realized, therefore, that the working class would never rise up and seize control of the levers of the economy and of commerce and all the rest of it. And so they decided to take a different route to undermine the West. They decided to go to the culture. They decided to have a culture war. They decided to seize control by what was called the long march through the institutions, to seize control of the institutions of the culture, of the universities in particular, of the schools, of law, of religion, of the civil service, of the media, all the institutions that create and carry a culture. The left decided to seize control and to undermine them from within by working against the values of the West from within those institutions. And then they would capture the West and they would basically destroy the premise on which the West was based. Now, this in Britain was carried out to the letter. And that was because, unlike in this country, where you had a similar attempt to undermine all the values of the West, but in this country you had what's been called the culture wars. You had two sets of people fighting each other over this, and you still have. And which side is winning the culture war is another matter. But basically in this country, the difference between this country and Great Britain is that in this country you have very strong churches who understand that their role is to defend biblical morality and the values, the ethical values that lie at the very heart of Western civilization. And for reasons that I won't bore you with, in the United Kingdom, the Church of England, which is the established church, is completely the opposite. The Church of England has led the rout, has led the flight from biblical morality for all kinds of reasons. And as a result, in Britain, there was no bulwark of defense. You have a bulwark of defense. It may not have worked very well, but that's not the point. You have a bulwark of defense against this undermining of Western values. In Britain, there was no such bulwark of defense. And so in Britain, basically, this was carried out to the letter, and Britain's demoralization really did take hold. Now, all this undermining of Western values created a vacuum. It created a situation in which in Britain and in Europe, and I would suggest also you have this in your elite universities, in your elite classes. It created a vacuum in which people no longer knew what they stood for or believed in. And into this vacuum came Islamization. The Islamists understood very, very, very well how the West was thinking and how it was feeling. They understood the West far better than the West understood itself. They understood that secularization in Britain and Europe in particular was creating this vacuum. And they understood what secularization does to a country, because I think it's only religiously minded people who understand the role that religion has in underpinning a culture and what happens when that religion is no longer underpinning it. So in they have marched in various ways, through mass migration, the refusal to integrate, and through Islamic terrorism. Now, I have to tell you, and I know this is not popular in many groups in America, but I think it's very important for everybody to accept and acknowledge that there are many millions of Muslims who are genuinely not signed up to what I call Islamism. I use the word Islamism because I think it's very important to acknowledge there are many Muslims who are not signed up to what we all see and fear. That is an interpretation of Islam which is militant, which is aggressive, which is jihadi, which seeks to Islamize the world that's not Muslim or not Muslim enough, and all the rest of it. I call that Islamism, or political Islam, and there are many millions of Muslims who not only don't sign up to that, but have fled it. They have come to Britain and to Europe because they want to live under human rights. They don't want to live under the religious persecution and oppression and worse in the countries that they've come from. And I think it's very important that we understand that that is the case, that we don't tar everybody who is a Muslim with the same brush. And nevertheless, it is also the case that there are many millions of Muslims who are unfortunately signed up to this militant form of Islam, and they intend to, either through waging terrorist war or through cultural encroachment, to basically take over and destroy the West. And that is obviously something that should concern us all. Now the problem has been, and you have it in this country as well, we all suffer from this. It is an astonishing thing that our political class in Britain and in Europe and in America, by and large, simply refuses to accept that Islamic terrorism has anything to do with Islam. It is absolutely astonishing. In Britain, you may recall just a few weeks ago there was an atrocity at the Houses of Parliament, where a Muslim man got a vehicle and drove it along Westminster Bridge, mowing down the very large number of pedestrians and tourists who were on the bridge. He then got out of his car, or vehicle. He managed to get inside the precincts of the Palace of Westminster, where the Houses of Parliament are. And I know that you as Americans will find this very hard to believe, but there is a gate outside the entrance to the Palace of Westminster, which is not manned by an armed police officer. Okay, it's Britain, you have to accept that. He got into the grounds of the Houses of Parliament, and he was shot dead, but not before he had stabbed to death an unarmed police officer. This caused a great trauma in Britain, as you may imagine, and the Prime Minister, Theresa May, made a statement to the House of Commons, which was very, very well regarded. She was statesmanlike. She said all the right things. Everybody said it was a flawless performance. Well, not to me. It wasn't a flawless performance, because she said one thing which really I thought was really appalling. She said that this attack was nothing to do with Islam. It was Islamist, but not Islamic. Now, as I've said, I use the word Islamist because I think it's important to distinguish between the political militants type of Islam and the stuff that's not. However, the idea that Islamism, political Islam, is nothing to do with Islam is really quite ridiculous. So one has to ask why our politicians are going to such lengths to deny this. You have this here with H.R. McMaster, who has been reported as saying that it's very unhelpful to talk about Islamic terrorism. And that ISIS or Daesh is not really Islamic at all, and all this kind of rubbish. Now, why are such intelligent people who are responsible citizens and stellar in many respects in their professional lives, why do they take this view? I think there are many reasons for it. Partly it's fear. Fear in Britain, certainly, that if you start being, if you start telling the truth about Islamic terrorism and Islamic extremism, you might promote more terrorism. There is the political correct mindset, which has bamboozled people to such an extent that they really do believe that it's racist to criticize somebody who comes from the developing world. And I think in Britain and in Europe, and maybe here too, there is also a problem that if you are a secular society, if you're secular, as I've said before, you probably don't really understand quite what religious fanaticism is. So there are many reasons why this sort of madness has gripped our political class. Anyway, I think that what's been happening, just to sort of draw my remarks slightly more to a conclusion, although it's rather a long conclusion. I think that what's been happening in Britain, Europe and America in particular, in these great movements, these great populist movements, is a great revolt against all of this stuff. It's a great revolt against the erosion of Western national identity, the undermining of Western values. It's a great cry for the ability to govern ourselves, to regain our freedom to govern ourselves. And it's a great cry against not just the threat from militant Islam, but a great cry against an entire political elite which has not only refused to acknowledge what this threat is, but refused to deal with it, and worse still, demonized as Islamophobes, as racists, anybody who expresses a concern about it. So it was a great revolt against all this, which I think is the first proper expression of cultural health I have seen in several decades of the culture wars. It's the first time I can remember a victory for my side in the culture wars, and a victory for those who want to defend the West. And it's very easy to pick holes in our leaders. And I think that, I think there are questions about our leaders. I think that in Britain and in America and in Europe, leaders are being thrown up by these great events who are not necessarily arriving in these positions of power because of their own superior qualities of statesmanship. They're as often as not arriving in positions of power because the rest of the political class is so hopeless. And this is a matter of some concern. Because I do think now, the sort of hand of history is really falling very heavily upon all these leaders. I am very encouraged by your president, or I have concerns about him. What encourages me is that he has shown so far a great instinct that he will defend America's interests, that he will not allow those who attack America to do so with impunity anymore. And this, I think, reverses absolutely for the better, not just the terrible situation for the last 8 years, where America has retreated from that position, retreated from the idea that it should defend itself and should defend freedom and Western values, but it's a repudiation of the dominant Western ideology, which says, I'm afraid to say, and this is what grips Britain and Europe very much, it says that it's never justifiable to go to war to defend Western interests because the West itself is not justifiable, and that anyone who attacks the West from the developing world, that they can never be held responsible for what they've done because they are basically the victims, the historic victims of the West, and as the historic victims of the West, we can never hold them to account for what they do to us. On the contrary, it's our fault that they are killing us. And this madness is the kind of default position in the whole of the Western establishment, the literary, political, cultural, media establishment, and has been for many decades. How many times have I heard it said, war never solves anything? Now, I believe that war should only ever be a last resort. But the idea that war never solves anything, what would these people have said in 1939? Well, I know what they said in 1939, 1938. They said we must not go to war. And as a result, many more, hundreds of thousands of people died as a result of that belief. But the belief has taken hold over the years that you must never stand up ultimately to defend the West. Instead, you must always negotiate, you must do conflict resolution, you must do peace processes, you must do international law. We must do law, not war. Well, there's a role for all these things, but ultimately, if you're not prepared to defend your society will not be able to defend itself against the threats that it faces. So I think this underlying trend, the return of Western national identity, has the capacity to save the West. Because as I've said, undermining the nation has undermined Western values, it's undermined democracy, it's undermined what we all are supposed to believe, that what we all are supposed to understand we share with each other. These are values that we want to defend. And, I think, I think it's only a nation, people who belong to a nation, who love a nation, who are patriotic, who love their country. It's only those people who are ultimately prepared to defend their country, ultimately prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Because you will only fight and die for a country that you feel you belong to, that you share, it's your homeland, you share the common project. I can assure you, nobody in Britain or Europe will ever fight and die for the European Union. They will only ever fight and die and defend for Britain, for France, for all these countries. And so the idea that, you know, if Britain goes it alone, we're going to see the return of nationalism, which is bad, and if heaven forbid the European Union should break up, we're going to see the nightmare return, the nightmare that European nations will become nations again, and then they will all start fighting each other. Well, there is a risk. But my goodness me, we are seeing what the European Union has done, this idea of transnationalism, this idea of the brotherhood of man. We're seeing the rise of some very obnoxious groups in Europe, some groups which have neo-Nazi pasts, truly neo-Nazi pasts, and they are arising because the entire mainstream political establishment has ignored and, not just ignored, but said it will have nothing to do with these major concerns of millions of ordinary Western people to do with the need for democratic self-government of their nation, the need to defend Western values, and the need to defend the Western nation against the threat from Islamization. So, for all these reasons, from my point of view, I think if the European Union were to break up, mainland Europe would once again have a chance of surviving. But none of this is going to happen in a straightforward way. We are going to see a fight to the death by the progressive worldview. We are engaged now in a titanic battle for Western culture. And how our leaders deal with this, how this battle is resolved, will determine whether the West continues on its suicidal path or whether it pulls back from the brink. As I've said, I have doubts about the caliber of all our leaders to rise to this challenge. I think the West is at a historic tipping point. I am optimistic because until this moment, until Brexit happened, until President Trump was elected, there wasn't a tipping point at all. The West was simply going down. Now it's a tipping point, but it's a point of crisis. It's a point of choice. It's a point where the West can go one of two ways, either down and out or pull itself back from the brink. And whether our leaders are up to this momentous civilizational burden now on their shoulders is a very open question, and I hope good people like you will continue to hold their feet to the fire and make sure they are up to the job. Thank you very much.
We have time for some questions, even though we're running a little bit late here. So I'll come down here. If you have a question, line up. Who's up first? Shirley? Simon.
Simple question. What is, we know the associations of Western civilization, but what is your definition of, so we know the associations of a Western society, but what is your definition of a Western society? In other words, is Saudi Arabia a Western society, or China with pseudo-capitalism, is that a Western?
Okay, what is a Western society? Would Saudi Arabia or China be a Western society? No, because Western society is a cultural definition. It's not defined by economics. It's not defined by capitalism. You can have a capitalist country that's not Western. China is quite a good example, where they've gone into capitalism but they don't have a Western outlook. What is a Western outlook? Actually, it's quite a complicated question, because there is a difference between the Western outlook that's embodied in mainland Europe and the Western outlook that's embodied in Britain. And again, the Western outlook that's embodied in America. They're all subtle differences. But I think that, there are common features to them. And it's basically, I would say that Western culture, Western society rests on an idea of freedom and of self-government and of equality, by which I don't mean the kind of equality that's become the sort of politically correct equality, which means that everyone's entitled to exactly the same outcomes regardless of how they behave. That's, I think, is leading us to ruin. I mean the equality that basically says we respect human life of everybody. We respect everybody. We respect the dignity of every human being. And these values that I'm talking about are rooted in the Hebrew Bible as expressed in the West through Christianity. And one of the problems with Britain is that we've moved completely away from that. I mean, in Britain, basically, the prevailing wisdom or unwisdom is that anybody who has any kind of religious belief is basically raving mad, just bonkers.
Except for Muslims, of course.
Yes, well that's another story. That to me is what defines Western societies, those values based on the Hebrew Bible and Christianity.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Phillips, thank you very much for enlightening me quite a bit. Understanding aspects of counterterrorism. You mentioned that there are people of the Muslim faith that are not as radical as others, and I agree. But if they are of the Muslim faith, they follow the Quran. And the Quran is not a friendly book. Its purpose is to destroy our civilization, the non-Muslim people. And my question would be, is what would you say of people coming into our country and trying to impose their values and their methods on us, which they're doing right now in our school systems, they're doing it in our society, and I think something needs to be done about it. So I really don't believe, I'm of the belief that a Muslim is a Muslim. Sorry, but that's, they go by the book, they're Muslim.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, and it's a very common view that I come across, and I would say one or two things in response to that. First of all, there are many people who call themselves and consider themselves to be Muslim, but who are not religious at all. They're what I would call cultural Muslims. They come from Muslim countries, they come from Muslim families. There's a Muslim culture, and they can be non-practicing. They don't keep anything at all. The religion doesn't mean very much to them at all, but they identify themselves as Muslims. And so for those people, the Quran is almost beside the point. And I know that may sound strange, but there are many people in Britain like that. The second thing is that what you say about the Quran is a perfectly valid point. But there are, first of all, there have been throughout history, and there are today, societies and communities of Muslims who choose to select from the Quran and other Muslim religious texts material which supports a spiritual interpretation of their religion, which does not involve itself in politics. Now, you may say, well, they are completely wrong, because the Quran is just what it is. But I would suggest to you that it's not for us to say that their interpretation is wrong. All I can say is that there are such people who always existed, and they exist today, and they have an interpretation with which we can all live, because it's a kind of spiritual interpretation of a religion as a source of spiritual sustenance. Now, the third thing to say, but I have to say that they are not very, very numerous. They're not very numerous, and that's been a major problem. But the third thing to say is this: there are Muslims who are religiously minded individuals. Well, perhaps I'm not sure whether they're religiously minded or not, but there are Muslims who are what I would call genuinely reformist Muslims. I'm not for a moment dismissing the problem that many people purport to be moderate when they are not. That is a serious problem. And many purport to be moderate when they really are not. Fine. But there are reformist Muslims, i.e. Muslims who understand and acknowledge that there is something wrong with the theology of their religion and it has to be reformed. Now, these people take their lives in their hands. They are incredibly brave. And in my view, the West should be doing everything it can to support and promote them in the hope that they can manage to pull this off. I don't know whether they can pull it off. I'm not a Muslim scholar. I've not the faintest idea whether theologically it's possible to reform their faith. They think that they can. They should be given every encouragement to do so. But we cannot do so. We have not done so at all. We ignore these people completely. Either we say, well, Islamic terrorism, either we say all Muslims are the same. All Muslims are the same, the Quran is what it is, the Muslim faith is irredeemable, you cannot reform it. In which case, these reformers are cast out by us, or alternatively, like our political leaders, we say Islamic terrorism's got nothing to do with Islam. Well, if it's got nothing to do with Islam, then what are these Muslim reformers trying to do? It's completely irrelevant, isn't it? So either way, we cut them off at the knees, when we should actually be doing everything we can to support these people and hope against hope that they manage to succeed. And I'll just leave you with one final anecdotal thought. You may or may not have read, I don't know, it was a couple of years ago maybe, President Sisi of Egypt went to Al-Azhar University in Cairo. Al-Azhar is the center of Islamic jurisprudence in the world. The imams there, what they say goes. It has a great deal of authority. It is the place. President Sisi of Egypt went to Al-Azhar. He stood before an assembly of hundreds of imams, and he said, more or less in these words, this lunacy has to stop. You cannot have a situation where 1.6 billion Muslims are trying to murder the entire population of the rest of the world. We have to stop this. We have to have an Islamic reformation. Now, we should be supporting that. In Britain, I don't think I saw any media coverage of that speech at all. At all. Nobody takes any notice of it. And I think that it's not for us to say what Islam is or is not. But we should be looking at these very brave people and giving them every support in the hope that they can reform their religion.
Would you like to turn the spotlights off?
It's okay.
John.
Yeah, hey Melanie, thank you. Your talk tonight was as enlightening now as it was at the University of Redlands 2 years ago. Thank you very much. And your comment and question. In 1986, I was on my way being stationed in West Germany, and I stopped at Speaker's Corner at 3 Days in London, and I thought it was one of the greatest places of democracy you've ever been. So I went back there in 2012 the first time, and a bunch of Islamists just yelling at me for whatever reason or the other. And I was just sad to see that happened. It's such a great place.
Well, I think we've got ourselves into a terrible confusion in Britain because Islamist preachers can, preach their horrible stuff at Speaker's Corner, and that's called freedom of speech. But if you're a Christian of a traditionalist kind, and you stand in the street and read the relevant bit of the Bible which prohibits homosexuality, you're arrested. So freedom of speech has become a little bit of a strange thing in Britain. That some speech is free and some speech has become very much not free.
So my question is, and you touched on this a little bit, what is it about political correctness that has such a hold on people that even liberals, right, rational, intelligent, moral people will suddenly just lose their marbles in the face of political correctness?
Okay.
What is the magic grip of political correctness
Okay.
that keeps these people from thinking rationally?
Don't get me started on political correctness, I'll be here all night. Political correctness is a term which really, I think, doesn't do justice to what it actually is. Because what it is basically, I would say it's cultural totalitarianism. It's the desire to snuff out opinion or beliefs that don't mesh with your own. Now, the reason why it is being used in this way to suppress all alternative points of view is fundamentally quite simple and quite devastating. If you are a progressive person, and I should know this because for 20 odd years I worked with the Guardian newspaper, which is like the New York Times on speed, but anyway. If you're a progressive person, it's not simply that you have a point of view and other people will have a different point of view. If you're a progressive person, you believe in all good things. You believe in progress, you believe in reason, you believe in the betterment of the human condition, you believe in improving the lot of your fellow human being. You're a person of conscience, you're a person of compassion, you're a person of feeling, you put others first. In other words, you stand for virtue, and everything you believe is part of that. So you believe in anti-racism. Now, we should all not be, I hope, racist, but nevertheless, this is a particular ideology which means that you basically give a free pass to anybody who claims to be in a victim group, a group that's been oppressed by the majority. Whatever it is, you subscribe to a number of ideologies which brook no dissent because they are harnessed to the project of virtue. Now, if you stand for virtue, if I as a progressive person stand for virtue, everything I believe is innately good and for the benefit of the human race. You come along and you say, well, excuse me, but I don't actually agree with your point of view because, and you say, don't even tell me why. The fact you oppose me, because I'm a virtuous person, means that you are a really evil person because you are against me and so you are against virtue. So you must be a right-winger because I'm a progressive left-winger, and we all know that right-wingers, because they're against the left, right-wingers stand for all bad things in the world. They stand for selfishness, they stand for greed, they stand for an absence of compassion, they are hard-hearted, they don't care about anybody else, they believe that the world can go to hell on a handcart because they are against us. And so if you believe that, then you have to suppress the person who's against you, the progressive person. And so you have to basically, you can't even have the argument. You have to drive them out of the public sphere, out of the public space altogether. And so the way you do that is not necessarily by law, although that may come into it, but the way you do it, which is really devastating, is you assassinate their characters. You hang a label around their neck, you say, right wing. And so I would come along and say to the progressive person, but this is the truth, this is evidence, and here are books to show you that there is the evidence that means that your idea is wrong. Sorry, truth is a right-wing concept. And we cannot allow it to interfere with our belief. And it's like a religious belief, it's like a fanatical religious belief of, say, the Middle Ages, where you had heretics who went against, it wasn't just the received wisdom of the day, you went against the doctrine, and it couldn't be allowed, because it would unleash evil on the world. That's what political correctness is all about. It's cultural totalitarianism.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Is that part why the leftists and the Islamists seem to get along so well? We both have these religious-oriented
Well, you make a very good point. The connection between the left and the leftists and radical Islamists is partly because, although they have a different idea of the society they want to bring about, they both understand that each other is in the business of destroying the West. And so they make a kind of unholy alliance on that basis alone. But I think there's a deeper philosophical point, which you're alluding to, which is that they're both what's often called Manichaean. Manichaeanism is where you divide the world into good and evil. There is nothing in between. So if you are a pious Muslim, you believe that the world of Islam is the world of God and the world of goodness, and everything that's not Islam is the world of the devil. Everything. And so you have to destroy it. You have a bounden duty to destroy it. And it's very, very similar to the leftist, who believes that everything that leftist stands for is good, and everything that stands against that leftist program is the work of, they wouldn't call it the devil, but they would certainly say it has to be stamped out. It's very similar.
I heard you touch on fascism a little bit and the way it affected Europe after World War II. On us, we look at the news and we see the Antifa and their bunch of spoiled brats up in Berkeley being, fully out of control. In the context of what you're talking about here tonight, could you explain to us who the Antifa is as it originates from Great Britain and the European concept?
We don't have an Antifa. I mean, I'm not even sure what that is, quite frankly. I mean, I've come across this word only in the last few days. But this is, can you be a little more specific? Oh, I see.
It gives the idea that it comes out of European.
Okay, right.
What we see at Berkeley has absolutely no match compared to anything that might have happened in the past in the European context of fascism. They don't match. They're just like the latest recruiting group that the Democrats use. Last year was like voice.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm still not quite sure whether you're saying that the people who are suppressing free speech on the campus at Berkeley are fascists or supposedly anti-fascists. Either way, is not true. I'm sorry. I would say the latter is not true. They are not anti-fascist. They are what I would call a kind of liberal fascism.
We got a long line here, and we're running a little bit late, but everyone seems to be interested, so we're going to extend the questions here, so hang with us. Shirley.
Melanie.
Hello.
I have wondered, and I wonder if you feel the same way. During the 1930s, we faced Hitler. The United States didn't face him. They ignored him. They let him go. Our diplomats came back and said, ignore him. It's okay, that's over there, we're here. And during the Obama administration, we had somewhat of the same thing. We aren't going to arm ourselves. We're going to cut our military. We're going to try to get along with these guys and just kind of let them go. I think that's a great parallel. And I think with Donald Trump, since he's came into office, he's shown us a new way.
Yeah.
He's shown us a way of strength, and he's going to hold his own and make this country strong again, which we've all heard. But do you see that parallel also?
I do think there are parallels. I think one should not stretch it too far because the situation, I'm very wary of saying, it's like 1939 all over again. But there are parallels in that it's an instinct for appeasement. This idea that you can actually negotiate your way out of a situation where you're facing what I would call a non-negotiable agenda. Hitler was a non-negotiable agenda. ISIS, Al-Qaeda are non-negotiable agendas. Beyond that, we today regard many of the non-negotiable agendas we face, and I think particularly Iran, as negotiable. And if you try and negotiate with a non-negotiable agenda, first of all, it's a kind of surrender. Because by definition, if it's non-negotiable, then you are giving some ground to an agenda which should be completely beyond the pale. And by doing that, you don't ever bring about peace and justice, and you don't ever avoid war. You create it because you incentivize the person or the group
of the country with the non-negotiable agenda, that if you're giving some ground, then all you've got to do is ramp up the non-negotiable agenda, ramp up the threat, and you'll get them to give you even more ground. And that's the terrible route that appeasement takes us down. And for the reasons that I've set out, the mood has set in among it's a kind of default position in the West that above all, we must avoid war. Now, I wish to avoid war wherever possible. But if you don't actually use the threat, the ultimate threat, that you will ultimately, if pushed, ultimately take military action to defend your national interest, then the other side, with its non-negotiable agenda, has you over a barrel right from the start. And that's what we've been doing over the years. We've been talking about, everything is a matter of negotiation. Everything is a matter of conflict resolution. I believe if you're a young person, you do international, it's not what it's called international, it's called, it used to be called war studies. But now it's all about conflict resolution. It's this idea that everyone should sit down in a room together, preferably with a good lawyer, and just thrash it out.
I agree with the latter point. That's a very good idea.
Yeah, great.
A few more questions here.
As I understand it, when we separated from Great Britain, 1776, we have the notion that you did not have to be a member of the Anglican Church or the Baptist Church in order to be a citizen of the United States, and that we're a secular society, well, perhaps a pluralist society. But is not Islam a theocracy? And why is it that we could allow communities like Dearborn, Michigan to establish essentially a theocracy in a pluralist society?
How can we allow a culture which is essentially theocratic, a theocracy, to establish itself in our centres? I think, really, you've sort of hit the nail on the head. In my view, a liberal society should say to minorities, you are welcome to settle in our country. We welcome, up to a point, we welcome immigrants as adding to the value of the nation. But everyone who comes into our society has to come on an equal basis. And all minorities, the deal from the Enlightenment was that all minorities should be tolerated in that they are given the freedom to organize themselves as communities of faith, to organize themselves as cultures, as individual, as cultures of faith. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I can't quite hear myself speaking. But provided that those communities of faith accept the law of the land, they must accept that they are under the umbrella of the core values and laws of the land.
That's right.
Now, that is the basis on which all minorities have always lived. That's the deal. That's the deal of liberal society. Now, the problem has been that we have not enforced that. We've been so frightened by various stuff, either literally physically frightened or frightened by political correctness or whatever it is, that we have not said to those Muslims who say, excuse me, we want you to adapt to us. We've not said to them what we should say to them, which is, you are welcome, but you have to live on the same basis as everybody else, which means one law for all.
Yes.
And that has to be enforced. And that, in my book, the dividing line is Sharia law. Sharia law, Islamic religious law, does not, as I understand it, it believes itself to be the law, the word of God, and as a result, it does not accept that any kind of secular authority can be established over it. Therefore, it is in itself inimical. It is not possible to have that living alongside or living within a liberal democratic society whose fundamental core value is one law for all. So in my view, what the West should have done, what Britain should have done, what Europe should be doing, what America should be doing, is say, you're welcome, but no Sharia law. No Sharia law.
That's right.
And that dividing will enable us to welcome people who are of the Muslim faith, of the Muslim culture, on the same basis as any other minority. We will not discriminate against them because they're Muslim. When we say you have to abide by the law of the land. And that's what we've not done. That is why in Britain we have a parallel jurisdiction growing up of Muslim communities which are effectively governed by an informal legal system, which they believe to be their legal system. And we have tolerated this so that we have two sets of laws developing. And that is the way you destroy a society. You cannot have one society which is organized basically on tribal lines, which has more than one jurisdiction in it. That to me is the dividing line. It's all about law.
Yeah, we're going to indulge everyone's patience. We have more people waiting in line, so let's maybe try to go quick over the questions, and we'll wrap it up here.
How you doing? Yes, I'd like to talk about the migration from Syria and that war-torn area of the Middle East. A lot of those folks are being pushed into Germany, Sweden, England, throughout Europe. And what I'm not hearing tonight is the upper echelon of society, the elitists, these super wealthy types that are it's a classic divide and conquer as far as the way I look at it, a lot of folks look at it in this country, what's going on in Europe as far as pushing those folks, instead of locating them in Saudi Arabia, which they have thousands of air conditioned tents, we located those folks in the Middle East region and pushing them to Europe and pushing them to the US and Western areas. I was wondering if you could talk about the power players that are making this happen, that are above.
Well, the dam was breached, if you like, by Angela Merkel, who astonished everybody when faced a couple of years ago by this great tide which was pouring in on boats into Europe, and taking advantage of the doctrine of the European Union that you have free movement between countries, free movement of peoples. So they were pouring into Greece and overwhelming Greece and pouring into Italy. And Angela Merkel said, let them in. And about 1 million, mainly young Muslim men, came into Germany and caused a great deal of social problems as a result. And one of the problems is the European Union countries do not have the power to set their own migration levels because of the core doctrine of the European Union, that the countries of the European Union are basically one mega state, and therefore people should be able to move freely across borders. So you can't have your own immigration policy. It's one of the reasons why Britain wants out of the European Union. It wants control over its own immigration policy. So that is a very serious, an extremely serious problem. As far as, you say the tents in Saudi Arabia set up because of the Hajj pilgrimage and so on. That is true, but on the other hand, you can't suddenly start saying, Saudi Arabia, well, you take them all. They're not Saudi citizens. And in other words, this is a very difficult problem, and it's very frustrating that the countries of the Arab world and Muslim world are not taking people in. But the people who are coming out don't want to go to those countries, and you can't force countries of whom these are not the citizens to take them. So it is an extremely difficult problem, which can only be addressed in a rather messy way. You have to basically make it. You have to stop the incentives for the people smuggling trade, which has grown up, you can't really stop those incentives while you have this crazy system in Europe where you don't actually have national borders.
Two more questions. Fine.
Well, first of all, I'm very impressed. You're a great speaker. Some things I want to say is England ought to be eternally grateful for the US of A. That's number one. And number two, if anybody wants a real definitive explanation of what the Quran is, you ought to read chapter 9 of the book of Quran. I understand it quite details this what the Quran is and what they want to do, their end goal. And number three, I don't believe any Muslim from a questionable Muslim country should allow to cross our southern borders until they're properly fit. And that's for technology. So thank you very much.
Okay, well I think that was a comment rather than a question, so I think I'll pass on.
You have the honor of the last question. Make it good and short.
No pressure then.
I think I can do that. I'm in business and I deal with Muslims from the very educated, the very wealthy, and the average. I've spoken in the mosque in Corona a couple of years ago, and so I interact with them. Personally, I'm very suspicious. I don't know who to trust.
Sorry, what is your question?
How does one differentiate between one that can be trusted and is an American and one who isn't?
It's very difficult on an individual basis to know because you can't look into someone's soul, can you? What you have to do is to kind of lay down certain lines and show that the society will not tolerate certain stuff. So, for example, as I said, I think the line should be drawn on Sharia law. I think another line should be drawn about foreign funding of mosques. There should be none. No foreign funding of mosques. You lay down those lines, and then I'm not saying the problem will go away, but the problem is multiplying because we're not drawing any of these lines in the sand. So we're giving the impression that we're just, it's an open season. We have to stop doing that. We have to start drawing lines in the sand, and then I think the situation can be brought more under control. On an individual basis, it's very difficult. You have to use your own judgment. You have to listen carefully to what people are saying, and you have to form a conclusion.
I just could not say no to Agnes Griffin. He was one of our best and greatest activists. So,
Thank you. I was born in Budapest, Hungary, and last year in October, our Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, had an election that 45% of the population turned out to vote against allowing Muslims in the country, and 95% said no. How feasible is that to go through in Europe or be accepted in other countries in Europe?
There was an opinion poll in Britain in the last few months, which, was it in Britain or in Europe? I think it may have been in Europe.
But 10 countries.
What?
But the one you're thinking about, the one I read about, was 10 countries in Europe.
Yeah, but but in Britain, which is what I noticed, getting on for half the population wanted an end to all Muslim immigration. What are the prospects of that happening? At the moment, zero. No government in Britain would do that. They would think it was discriminatory, and you were basically demonizing an entire people, and it just wouldn't happen. Will it happen in the countries of mainland Europe? If Marine Le Pen were to become president of France, it's perfectly possible that would happen. Perfectly possible. But we're told that the centrist Emmanuel Macron will win on Sunday. So, but who knows? I'm sure you don't need to be told that political prediction is really a mug's game. Nobody should predict anything. So I don't think that is feasible, and it's not feasible for countries which have a tradition of human rights and liberty. And the countries that will do it are countries which don't have that tradition. So countries of Eastern Europe, I'm afraid to say, because I say I'm afraid to say because they don't have a strong tradition of human rights and liberty, which I think is that is a pity. But it's those countries that you will find the most condign attitude towards keeping all Muslims out. You won't, unless there is some seismic development, which is perfectly possible in the countries of Western Europe. I wouldn't expect you to find it. I wouldn't expect you to find it coming to pass there.
And with that, we just cannot thank you enough for taking time to
The questions that you asked tonight are very important ones. walking around and listening to this wonderful lady